Well, good morning to everyone here in North America. Good afternoon to everyone across the pond where Joanne is. Greatly appreciate everyone who has already been waiting for us to get started. You are on it today, ready to rock and roll. And I'm really excited to hear from all of you in the chat. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Joanne Paul on, author of Thomas More and the Classical Thinkers series, Counsel and Command in Early Modern English Thought, The House of Dudley, and Thomas More, A Life, which I have my copy of, and I've made pencil marks all through it, and because I've become a fan now of this period, and now I can't stop. Joanne is a senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of Sussex, a BBC AHRC New Generation thinker. Her research focuses on the intellectual and cultural history of the Renaissance and early modern periods. She has written for the Cambridge University Press Ideas in Context series and has been widely praised for her work on Thomas More, William Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and Thomas Hobbes. She's appeared on a variety of television, radio, and podcast programs and served as a consultant for historical documentaries and drama. And I'm pleased to have her on a live stream today on YouTube. So, Joanne, how are you today?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, it's afternoon over here and getting very autumnal, which I really enjoy. So I miss the autumns in Canada, the colors and everything. It's not the same over here in England.
Oh, it's we are experiencing Canadian autumn right now, where one
Yeah.
day it's high temps, and then we're back down low, and it's like,
Yeah,
are we going to stop fluctuating anytime soon?
yeah. You leave the house in your big coat and you're carrying it home in the afternoon because it's 25 degrees.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm
Yeah,
still
yeah,
trying to get used to that, but
yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know if I ever will.
No, no one does. No one does.
Yeah. So, Joanne, I have to ask you right off the top, why did you ever want to study this period? What was the thing that got you into it?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've always loved this period. Like many, I read a lot of historical fictions as well as, a lot of sort of narrative, popular histories of this period. It's such a dramatic period and such a perfect canvas for telling really interesting stories. Um, and so, I grew up with that, but then when it came to my studies, I was there was always this pressure that I should do something more serious. I think sometimes the Tudor period can be seen only in that dramatic light, and a bit sort of frivolous, I suppose, by some. I'm about to say I don't agree with that, but just by some, I
Mm.
think that can be the case. And so I actually studied politics initially with a bit of history, and really became captivated by intellectual history, which is just a fancy way of saying the history of ideas, the history of concepts and things that people thought.
Mhm.
Um, and as I continued that study, I realized it was in the 16th century that I found a lot of the ideas that I found to be most interesting, that I found to be most important. And really, what I see in this period, to come to the actual answer to your question,
That's good.
is this really fascinating sort of liminal space in between the medieval and those things that seem, I think, very fantastical and foreign to us.
Mm.
Chivalry and knights on horseback and ideas that don't make sense to us anymore. Feudalism or something like it, and divine kingship and all of that. While at the same time, in this period, you're also starting to see the beginnings of something recognizably modern and something that we can relate to. And so, in addition to all the drama, I think that's what makes the Tudor period enduringly fascinating to us. Is that combination of the fantastical and the foreign and the familiar, and that's certainly what has appealed to me as well.
So you've obviously written on Thomas More, who we're going to talk about today, but you've also written on Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and Hobbes. And I would love to know which of those individuals would you like to go out to dinner with and have a chat with?
Oh gosh, well, I think, certainly not Hobbes. I don't think he was much of a conversationalist, or he probably was, but probably not with a woman.
Mm,
And, um,
mm,
I always see him as kind of crotchety. That's probably in part because, he started writing quite late in life comparatively, and lived to a very ripe old age. So I think I see him as eternally old and crotchety. He might have been very, very fun and entertaining as a young man. So probably not him. I think Machiavelli would have some great stories.
mm,
His political career was very wide ranging, and he met some amazing people. But again, I think not a lot of respect for women, and um, I'm not sure. Well, it might be fascinating to have a debate with him, but I think of all of them, probably Shakespeare.
mm.
Um, I think he had at least the capacity to write some very interesting women, and so probably had some very was up for very interesting conversations with women, and we're learning more and more about his relationship with his wife and how loving that relationship actually was compared to I think the way it's been presented to us. And of course, he was extraordinarily widely read, um, and yeah, I think probably Shakespeare. I suppose it's also influenced by the fact that I imagine him to look like Ralph Fiennes. And so that's probably influencing it a little bit as well.
It might be. It might be. So what drew you to Thomas More as a subject, as an individual? How do you decide that this is the person you want to frame this particular book off of?
Well, in some ways, I wasn't drawn to him, at least initially. I'd worked on him a bit on my PhD project, which, as you kindly said, was later published as a book with Cambridge. He featured in there, and so I had encountered him and read some of his works. And off the back of that, a friend of mine who worked for a small press in the UK called Polity
Mhm.
asked me to write a book about Thomas More's ideas. And I was initially very resistant to that because he is such a controversial figure. But I eventually came around to the idea, well, it's just his works, it's just his thoughts and his beliefs, and I'm not getting into all those debates about his biography.
Mhm.
So that will be fine. So I spent a few years doing that, reading everything he ever wrote, and trying to get at the heart of what I thought his central beliefs were, which I actually see as very consistent across his entire life. Um, and that came out around the quincentenary of the publication of Utopia, um, almost 10 years ago now. And because of that, I ended up participating in a lot of events around that and talking to a lot of people about Thomas More and got asked very frequently what biography would I recommend? And I couldn't answer that question without qualification, because the biographies that had been written across the 20th century had tended to um, portray him in one very particular light or another,
Mhm.
either as this very saintly scholar, or as someone really emphasizing his darker side as a sort of antidote to that. So there'd been this sort of swinging of the pendulum
Mhm.
for many decades. And so I couldn't really recommend one without qualification. And there hadn't actually been a biography written of Thomas More since 1999, which is now more than a quarter century
Mhm.
ago. And so I came to the conclusion that we needed a new biography that came sort of more down the center and treated him as a historical figure and worked really with the material from the ground up. Um, and so I even wrote an article about how we needed a new biography. And then it was one of those things. It was a sort of creeping realization of, no, I should probably write it. I am one of those people. If I see something needs doing, and I think that I can do it, I go, oh, okay, I'll do it then. And once I had accepted that realization, I actually got really, really excited about the project. In part because I thought there was such a need for it.
Did you go in with any preconceived thoughts about him? I know you did the work for your dissertation and such, but knowing that there's these kind of two camps of looking at this individual, and it's pretty well defined camps. He's either a saintly individual or he's ruthless. Did you have any kind of way of looking at it where you're like, I kind of lean this way, but I really want to stay in the center until this is done?
Do you know, I don't think so. I think that I had encountered both views, sort of at similar times, and held them to have equal weight in the sense that I thought both probably had a kernel of truth, but had been over exaggerated. Um, and primarily, I'm very happy that I was able to rely on my historian's training to just treat him as I would any other historical figure, and use the sources of his time to try to tell the story of who he was, and what he believed and what happened to him. Um, so I had encountered all of those portrayals, um, but they're so extreme that it is actually hard to be fully convinced, I think, of them. And so for me, it was more that they evoked in me a sense of curiosity of okay, that surely that's not quite right. What was the case, and what is true, and how can I use the sources to try to not create, but portray, communicate, this fully realized human complex person.
What was Thomas More's early life like? Where is he from, and what was his educational background like?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first big mystery, is how do we get to that, and how do we know the things that we think we know about his early life? Because he's born in the 15th century. He's born in 1478. That's before we have anything like baptismal records or birth records, or anything like that. It's a fantastic thing that we do know his date of birth. That's because his father had it recorded in a sort of family compendium. Um, at the back, he wrote down all the dates of the birth dates of his children. And so we have that. But what was fascinating to me, and I went and saw it, and it's a wonderful thing that we have that, and it's digitized as well. So if anyone's interested, you can have a look at it. It's at Trinity College in Cambridge. Um, but so it's a fantastic thing we have that. But what was fascinating to me is that biographers, especially in recent decades, seemed convinced that we knew where he was born, which wasn't recorded in that book, and to me seemed quite phenomenal. There's even a plaque, that he was born on this site, and that site is Milk Street in Cheapside in London, which was a very fashionable, fairly wealthy part of London at the time, at the end of the 15th century. Um, and so I did some digging, and it turns out that the first mention of that is published 150 years after More's birth, and by someone who writes a biography of Moore and gets the date of his birth wrong, gets various other details wrong, invents things, has him performing miracles, all of this sort of stuff. So it's not the most reliable source in the world from a historical perspective. And so actually I think it's wrong. And I did a lot of research and a lot of digging, and I think I've been able to determine that he's actually born in an area called Cripplegate Without, which is just north of the London Wall, and even possibly been able to nail down the street, which was called Red Cross Street, which is very near St Giles, Cripplegate. So his upbringing was not in poverty or anything like that, but it wasn't in this well-to-do area. Outside the London Wall was a bit more lawless. It was often associated with trades that were either a little bit less than legal, or very, very stinky. They put everyone who was doing stinky things outside the London Wall, which included Thomas More's grandfather, who was a tallow chandler. So he turned animal fats into candles, essentially, which stinks.
Mm.
Um, so they were probably out there. His father was a lawyer, but his father had been a baker who had died when Moore's father was 16. So they didn't come from a long lineage of wealth or prestige on that side. More on his mother's side, but yeah, he hasn't got this sort of, he's not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, which I think is some of the portrayals. He goes to the only free grammar school in London, probably because his parents couldn't have afforded the fees otherwise. That may have been where his father went as well, how he went from baker's son, orphaned baker's son, to lawyer. And then gets a very fortunate break in that his father uses his legal connections to allow Thomas More to enter the household of the Lord Chancellor at the time, Cardinal John Morton, as a servant. And that gives him enough of a leg up. Morton, it seems, secures his place at Oxford, which allows him to encounter some of the higher learning of the time, and allows him to, well, enter what is now known as the Thomas More Circle, but was at the time, he was the least important, youngest member of it, and that really launches both his career, a political career, starting in the city, as well as his place in Renaissance scholarship.
What would that time of being a servant, trying to get up the rungs of the ladder or at least be seen, what would that have been like for him? Would that have been a way for him to showcase who he is and his talents, or would that have been something more mundane?
I think a little bit of both, probably. We don't know a whole lot. His son-in-law, an early biographer, William Roper, tells us that he waited on table, and so had the opportunity to serve and be around some of the leading counselors in the court of Henry VII, which, if true, is very significant, and would have been significant to him. We don't know if that's true. He may have had a slightly less prestigious task, mucking out the stables or something. We really don't know what he was doing
Mhm.
there. We know that he continued his education there, and that Morton was very interested in the education of young boys, of those in his service. He himself had sort of risen through the ranks, and that he, because he was Archbishop of Canterbury as well, he was associated with Canterbury College in Oxford, and had, there were spaces available there for the boys that he thought could take advantage of that, and then they were paid places. So he probably at some point obviously impressed Morton, or impressed the schoolmaster at Lambeth, who then passed that on to Morton. So it is a little bit of both. He was a servant, and he continued to be a servant even at Canterbury College. Part of the way that he sort of paid his way was by serving the monks who were also at Canterbury College. So he continued essentially being a servant, even at Oxford.
You emphasize in the book about Moore's interest in the European humanist movement,
Mm.
and his intellectual friendships that he gets later on after his education, especially with Erasmus, which I thought was really interesting. Uh, how does how do these kinds of friendships and these kinds of experiences, do you think, shape his basically philosophical outlook or even maybe a political outlook within Thomas?
Hugely. I mean, is the short answer. Moore wrote quite a bit later in life that he somewhat resented the nature of his education, his very medieval education, the focus on rote learning and sort of the arcane jargon of the academic world. He was the humanist movement was much more focused. Sorry, I have a cold. Was much more focused on the application of learning, practical application. He talks a lot, for instance, about common usage instead of these, arcane, ridiculous rules that people come up with somewhere in an ivory tower. Well, let's talk about how people are using language on the street, right? Let's talk about how our learning can be useful to the common good. So these were the things that he was very interested in, and was very much inspired by meeting those humanists who had traveled from England to Italy in order to experience the Renaissance there and sort of bring it back with them. And he was very lucky to meet many of them at Oxford and then continue his relationship with them when he moved to London. And this also included scholars who were not native to England, like Erasmus, who he meets in 1499. And he and Erasmus actually have a bit of a sort of meet cute in that they don't really like each other at first, but then become very, very firm friends later on. And they're all just so impressed with More. I mean, regardless of what you think of him, his political stances, we'll talk, I'm sure, about religious persecution, so on. It's hard to deny that he is one of the great minds of the English Renaissance. And all of these scholars, very learned, very experienced, very well traveled, are just so impressed with his proficiency with languages, with his intelligence, with his wit. And if you read Utopia, you can appreciate that even at a distance of 500 years.
We've brought up Utopia twice now, and maybe some people haven't read it or haven't read it in a very long time.
Yeah.
What is this book about that he writes? And given the basically the enduring influence of Utopia over generations, how should we read it today? Should it be like satire? Should it be a blueprint?
Mm.
Should it be something else completely? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just take a moment to plug the edition of Utopia that I've just done with Oxford University Press.
There you go.
If you haven't read it, this one's
Yeah.
fantastic. Um, uh, I, phew, I absolutely think it should be read as a satire. I don't think there's many today who would say that it's a blueprint. Um, it has all the trappings of a satire. The question I think then becomes, okay, what is he satirizing and why?
Mhm.
Of course, a satire then, as now, is often used to poke fun at the powerful, especially for their pride, for those things that they take pride in. For more that was often focused on wealth, social standing, and so Utopia is this ideal, impossible island where everything is held in common. There is no money, there's no property, there's no social status, and so those reasons for pride are arguably at least removed. Um, I mean, there's a lot more we can say about it, and I do, but I think one of the things he's trying to do for his readers is remind them that none of those things are real anyway, right? Money is an invention. It doesn't exist beyond the fact that we use it and we give it reality, right? Same with
Mhm.
property, right? There's nothing real about property. We draw a line and say that it's ours. Social status, nothing real about that. And so I think he's trying to create this reflection where we go, okay, well, there's this impossible island that is totally made up, totally fantastical, and yet in some ways it's got a better handle on reality than his contemporary England,
Mhm.
where everyone is so concerned about the value of gold, which is not actually that useful. Gold is not useful, right? You can't do
Right.
much with it. Um, Everyone is concerned with who is a duke or an earl, or we imbue these things with meaning. People are concerned with how much uh the clothes that they wear, and how much they're worth, but damask and velvet and everything else, it's not that useful for keeping you warm. And as he says, all of that stuff used to belong to sheep anyway. Right? Like, it's not, there's nothing real to it. And everyone bows to a man because of who his father was, and because he wears a weird piece of metal on his head, right? Like, that stuff is silly. And so I think Utopia is trying to point out how silly that stuff is, and how artificial it all is. Not to say that it needs doing away with, but that it shouldn't have the import, that we shouldn't invest the seriousness, and we shouldn't overlook that it is just fantastical, and that it all passes away when we die.
Mm. It sounds like the humanist has a slight touch of theory in there when he's like, "Well, this really isn't a real thing. This is man-made, and this is the history of that, and why are we doing this, and why are we doing that?" It's kind of like a rebellious kind of mentality against the norm. It seems like to
Yeah.
me. That's me thinking as a 20th century, 19th century historian, thinking, what would I say to a person in the 20th century who wrote this piece? It's kind of a rebellious way of looking at life, but maybe it's different in Moore's time, or it's
No,
slightly.
I think they had a not, I don't think, a quite rebellious bent. I think that probably goes a bit too far, but they
Mm,
were reformers. They were social critics. I think we can
mm,
use those, I mean, admittedly anachronistic terms, but I think that that's right. More definitely didn't advocate for anything like rebellion, but he just wanted people to understand that, this puffed upness that people get when they're full of pride about these things that they own or that they wear, or um, that kind of doesn't matter. It only matters insofar as we think it matters.
mm,
And that actually, he's very interested in the reminder of death.
mm.
It's a theme he comes back to again and again and again, that, remember, you can't take it with you. Right? It all passes away because it isn't real, it isn't enduring, it isn't eternal. And that's why, not this frontispiece on the front of this. Is it in here somewhere? Maybe not. But the later frontispiece for Utopia, is looks like a skull.
Mm.
So that it's a reminder of death, and Utopia, in some ways, the island itself represents not death itself, but just that reminder that in death we're all equal. In death we own nothing, right? In death none of that matters, and that's, I think, what Utopia is trying to evoke for the reader.
He's discussing end of life and that we can't take anything with us and things like that. How much does faith and religion play into this for him and for his life in general?
I mean, everything.
That's a
And not just for him.
mm,
You can't separate religion from any part of 16th century life. It's not that we talk about politics and religion. It's that politics is religious, and religion is political, and that these things just don't get separated. It is a completely religious mindset, for Moore, and for everyone around him. So for him, these ideas, and many of these ideas, are he uses pagan, as he would call them, sort of classical authors, Cicero and the like, to he gets these ideas from them, and he uses these authors, to express these ideas. And Utopia itself is a pre-Christian society, so there is something, not Christian about some of the ideas, but for him, it does always come back to very Christian, very Catholic ideas, about death and the afterlife, and almost the anomaly, which is our life lived on Earth. there is an eternal before and an eternal after, and this is just a moment in that.
Mm. How does Thomas More get into the good graces originally with Henry VIII and others in court?
It's part through sort of circumstance, and part through his own ambition. More is ambitious. He appears to want that attention. He There's a friend of his who talks about him always sort of walking the halls in order to be noticed by Cardinal Wolsey, um, who at the time is the Lord Chancellor and Chief Minister essentially of Henry VIII. He's known as the other King, Alter Rex, because of his such important role. And it's really he that first takes notice of Thomas More, because of his work in London as a lawyer, and as beginnings of a sort of diplomat and negotiator. Um, and particularly, he goes on a trade mission to the Low Countries, where he writes Utopia, and that he does quite a good job. And so Wolsey notices him, and the king notices him, and he's just seen as someone who could be quite useful, because he is so intelligent, and he is so hardworking, and he has all of these connections and has all of this knowledge to bear, and he's very affable. That idea of man for all seasons, immortalized, particularly in the film as well as the play, actually comes from the idea that he can get along with anybody, and so that makes him very useful as well as a negotiator, and he's used primarily at the start of his service to Henry VIII as a sort of go-between for the king and Wolsey, because Wolsey can't keep up with the court all the time, and the king, he's got his own stuff to do, and so More acts as that intermediary between them, and he's very useful in that way, for primarily for Wolsey, but also for the king.
What are your thoughts on Wolsey going through this through the eyes of Thomas More? What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
Wolsey in general?
I mean, to be honest, Wolsey, because we don't have More really commenting on Wolsey
Hmm.
himself. He makes a few comments about Wolsey that are really the words of the king, at one point after Wolsey's fall. But he doesn't say much about him. I mean, Wolsey certainly, I don't think they agreed in terms of their approach to politics.
Hmm.
I mean, More was willing to be pragmatic at times, but I think Wolsey was more pragmatic than More would ever have been willing to be. And so I think he disapproved of some of Wolsey's tactics, while respecting his work ethic, which is impossible not to respect. I mean, Wolsey worked incredibly hard for Henry VIII, and of course, in some sense, suffers for that. Um, and so, I think More respected some elements of Wolsey, but I think the lessons that he took from him uh, were more not what to do, than what to do. Um, I think Wolsey creates quite a problem for More, and as More sees it, for um, the English state in general, in that he becomes an excuse, a lightning rod for a lot of resentment against the clergy in general, a lot of anti-clericalism, as it's known, and More is very against this, um, and so although he disagrees, I think, with some of Wolsey's tactics and pragmatism, and indeed corruption, he was corrupt. Um, I think at the same time, he wouldn't have condemned him in the terms with which he is condemned, because of the way it gets swept up, in this resentment of the clergy, fueled in many ways by the Lutheran movement.
Hmm. What about Henry himself? What does Thomas think of Henry before the fallout, let's say, between these two men? He's going as the go-between to Wolsey and the king. He must be very entrusted with messaging and demeanor and such. Is that a mutual kind of respect there, or is that all business relationship?
Um, yeah, I think we get this image of Henry and More, don't we, as sort of friends walking in the garden, discussing philosophy and astronomy and whatever else. Which is certainly not the case. I mean, I don't know that Henry VIII really had friends. If he did, well, maybe Charles Brandon, but that was about it. And it certainly wouldn't be someone like Thomas More, this lawyer's son from Cripplegate. More was a servant of Henry VIII, and a trusted one at that, but a servant nonetheless. We have these great letters because More is corresponding all the time with Wolsey, where we really get the sense that More is chasing him around with homework, with things to do, with papers to read, with documents to sign, and Henry literally laughs him off and says, "I'll do it later. You're boring. Go away." You know, but we also get this great insight where we know that More, for instance, was in one instance at least was in consultation with the king and queen in the queen's chambers late into the night about affairs in France. So he is let in, but Henry's not so interested in his opinion. That's very clear. He's interested in the cardinal's opinion and Wolsey's opinion, but More kind of doesn't get to express that, at least at that point. So there is this real distance, I think, there. In terms of what More thought about Henry, it's really hard to tell. More is very smart. He's not going to commit that sort of stuff to writing. I mean, what he will commit to writing is he thinks he's great, right? Which is what you do and what you say. For instance, one of the earliest pieces of writing we have from Thomas More is a coronation ode, which again is amazing. We have the manuscript itself. It is digitized. You can go and leaf through it online. It's amazing. But this coronation ode that he writes for Henry VIII when he is crowned, and obviously it's very laudatory, right? It's very flattering. But what's interesting is well, two things. One, in the humanist tradition, and Erasmus in particular is very clear about this, you praise a ruler, a leader, not because you think that they have those qualities necessarily, but because you want them to. And more importantly, you want other people to have the expectation that they will have those qualities. And so you publicly praise them for being charitable, in the hopes that they will, in fact, be charitable, right? He, like many others, praises him for his support of scholars, right? Because he wants him to support scholars, right? And there's warnings in there as well. He cautions. He essentially says, almost in as many words, that power corrupts, even the greatest minds, he says. So there are warnings and little flashes in there of this idea that he doesn't think that Henry VIII is necessarily the golden boy. He just kind of wants him to be, and is warning him against going the other way. The other thing to say is that Thomas More was intimately acquainted with a very dark side of Henry VIII, even before he enters his service in by 1518. He had been involved with various court cases. I talk, for instance, about the case of Richard Hunn, who is found murdered, probably in his cell, and the king sweeps it under the rug legally, essentially. But more importantly, with the May Day riots in London on the 1st of May 1517, which is xenophobic riots in London. Strangers are taking our jobs, foreigners are taking our jobs, that sort of thing. Nobody's really hurt, but Henry is so insecure and paranoid that he decides it's a rebellion against him, and has dozens of young men, apprentices, possibly boys as young as 12 or 13, slaughtered in the streets of London, hung, drawn, and quartered in the streets of London, and their corpses put up in the marketplaces as a warning to London, that, not to rebel. It had nothing to do with him, but he comes down in this very cruel, tyrannical way. And Moore has experience of that. He knows that he's involved in the prosecutions after the May Day riots. So he knows all of this going in and can't possibly be agreeing with it. And there are, if you're reading between the lines, there is some disapproval of Henry VIII, but you have to really read for it. So much so that it's hard to feel justified really articulating that is a criticism of Henry VIII, but there are moments there are moments that you see something like that.
We hinted at earlier Moore's religious persecution, if you will, of people. We've seen it in popular culture. He's presented sometimes as this the torturer in chief, basically, for some people who embrace Lutheranism and other Protestant thoughts. What was Moore like in that regard? I mean, he's deeply devoted to his faith. He's deeply devoted to a system of government that's intertwined with that faith. How does he see that kind of movement, or what does he do in response to that movement as in a position of power?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, initially, he's not that interested in Luther and Lutheranism. He's frankly too busy, and he says as much. He says, let people with more time figure out whether this is heresy or not. I've got other things to do. And it's actually Henry VIII who pulls him into the debate, because Henry has written against Luther. Luther has called him a strumpet and said that he should have his hands and his tongue cut off. Henry is less than pleased about this being published about him. But is a king and can't stoop to responding. And so in essence, he gets Thomas More to respond. And that's More's first volley into the debates of the Reformation, though he makes many, 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 many more after that. More is very, I guess the word would be disturbed, afraid of Lutheranism as he encounters it, as he sees it. He's particularly concerned with the way in which Lutheranism, as he understands it, gives the authority for reading scripture, interpreting scripture, understanding God's word to anyone, whatever, as he puts it. That there wouldn't be any consensus anymore. There wouldn't be any unity anymore. And he's very concerned about the effect that will have on society. And he sees anarchy and violence coming from that. He's concerned as well about Lutheran denial of free will, and the idea of by faith alone, that it doesn't require good works, because he thinks it gives people carte blanche to behave however they want. They don't have free will. It's all God's will. There are no consequences for the way I act on earth, just my faith. And so, he thinks it gives license to all sorts of violent and cruel behaviors. And he thinks that he sees that in actions and events such as the German Peasants' War and the sack of Rome. And so he connects these atrocities to the Lutheran movement, and is afraid. And that fear, leads him to hatred. And I think that's an important lesson. I think there's a tendency to just go, oh, well, 16th century people and their stupid religious ideas, right? They were being ridiculous. And just this sort of blanket condemnation of religious persecution, which obviously, we can condemn, but and should condemn, but it's also, I think, worth understanding, because of course there is bigotry today, the way in which someone like Moore, who is this brilliant mind, this social critic, how his fear leads him to a fierce, violent hatred, and then the approval of and participation in violence against this group. I think is an important lesson about how even the most quote unquote rational minds can get caught up in violent bigotry. So I think that that is important to take the time to understand. In terms of his actual role, he leads a raid on an area in London known as the Steelyard to recover smuggled books, Lutheran books, and interrogate some people involved in that. And we know as Lord Chancellor, there are three heretics, we'll use that word for the moment, they're perceived to be heretics, who he is involved with, who end up being burned at the stake. They and several others are imprisoned in his gatehouse in Chelsea. He had a set of stocks. That was not uncommon for a major landowner and statesman to keep the peace in his area. He says that he honestly entreats them in as hearty and loving manner as he can to recant their heresy. Others at the time, as today, said that he tortured them. That we cannot know the truth of. He denied it at the time. I mean, even if he was just imprisoning them, that's still, pretty awful. So certainly he's involved up to that point. He wasn't involved in the trials nor the executions. That was just not in his purview. And there's no evidence whatsoever that he was actively, he didn't light the fire or anything, as he is often portrayed as doing. And it is three that we're talking about. There were three heretics burned in London while he was Lord Chancellor. Again, I think sometimes the image is hundreds. And again, that's not to absolve, but just to understand what it is that we're actually historically talking about.
Yeah, historical memory can play tricks on people in that way, where we hear
Yeah.
things for generations and we take it as, or we almost play like the telephone game with history, or where we're like, oh, it just gets worse with each time we speak about an individual, and perhaps it went from 3 to 300, and it goes from there.
I have heard it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. Is this also why, Joanne, that he really sees when Henry decides he's going to go against the church, that he sees this as a stab in the back mainly, or is it something else with him, because he's been doing such good works, quote good works, for the church and doing Henry's bidding in this regard with Lutheranism or Protestantism coming about in the Reformation. And now it just seems like now you're just turning away from what we've been fighting for all this time.
Yeah, I don't know if he sees it as a sort of personal stabbing in the back, but certainly he's aware that the ground shifts. That Henry, Henry is never a Lutheran, but he, I think, more sees at least a parallel, if not a direct connection, between the pride of Henry and this sort of idea that he knows best and he can decide these things for himself, even as a layman, that he can hold all this ecclesiastical religious authority. I think he sees that as Lutheran in tone, at the very least, if not directly. That Henry is directly related, influenced, pardon me, by Lutheranism. He never speaks or writes about it directly. He's too smart for that. But I think he is worried about the spread of Lutheranism in England, and then obviously deeply concerned by the fact that Henry thinks that he can be supreme head of the church. You know, it's worth remembering that More is a profoundly legal mind as well. He doesn't think that legally Parliament has the authority to grant that to Henry. He doesn't think that legally Henry can hold that position. He doesn't think that legally they have the right to sort of separate out from the Catholic Church in that sense. He just doesn't think they have the jurisdiction to do that.
I wasn't really aware of More a lot until I became a Catholic. And then it
Mm,
was like, okay, on one side, I'm hearing this. On our side, I'm hearing this. This is really interesting that it still happens, that we still talk about him either as a saint or an absolute butcher. And
yeah.
I've often wondered if the truth was just somewhere in the center. And this is why I dove into your book uh, so
Mhm.
quickly when I received it, because I was like, I really want to understand this, to understand all these different things that I'm hearing and where are they
Mm.
possibly coming from. What do you, with that in mind, what do you think? Uh, is there, maybe in England more so than here? Is there a legacy of Thomas More there? Uh, Maybe even outside of the church or within the church? I'm not sure, but is there some kind of a legacy there, or some kind of footprint left behind by his life and his teachings or writings?
I think so. I think that there are numerous legacies of Thomas More that we can sort of touch and interact with
Mm,
today. And I think the the sort of variety of them speaks to the numerous ways in which he's been interpreted. Certainly, yes, there is a Catholic tradition. There are Catholic churches devoted to Thomas More. There is even an Anglican tradition, the church in which his head is buried, which, you know, celebrates him and his life, as an Anglican church. Um, uh, there's, of course, the historical tradition of him as well. He is often, even I think, in a secular way, held as a sort of patron saint of
mm,
statesmen, of lawyers. You know, he still has. There's a Thomas More Society, which is a legal society. He's still venerated in some way, as a great legal mind, as someone devoted to justice, in that sense. What I always find interesting is actually his legacy in the U.S., where he has a number of different associations. I think all of the ones I've already listed. One of the biggest Catholic churches in New York, I think, is St. Thomas More Church, which has, you know, a number of very important American figures have worshipped at that church. Um, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, for instance.
mm.
But there's also this very conservative tradition. The Thomas More, I can't remember if it's society or association or organization or something like that in the States, is a very conservative one, whose primary mandate is anti-abortion, for instance. So, you know, if you look up Thomas More in the United States, that will come up very quickly. So there's a number of legacies associated with him. I think he's come up quite a bit recently, because and this is part of what I'm interested in recovering about him, is because he's someone who spoke truth to power,
Mhm.
because he's someone who stood against what he and we might see as tyranny, and of course suffered for it, and because he often did so in a satirical manner. You know, we are seeing the the cancellation, the silencing of comedians, right? And satirists, who are social critics and who are critics of the powerful, and critics of those who take their power too far and who invest too much in things like wealth and social status, and who divide the community and don't remember their duty to the common good, and all of these things, right, that Thomas More stood for, and that many of these people today stand for. You know, I think these parallels are being drawn, and rightly so.
Yeah, I would love to see Thomas More on a late night talk show. talking about this because he's such
Yeah.
a social critic. It'd be really interesting, but at the same time, I'd probably cringe at some parts.
Well, there is, I mean, there is a legacy. Stephen Colbert has talked about his favorite film being A Man for All Seasons, and of
Mm,
course, Stephen Colbert is a Catholic as well. So I think I've never spoken to him about it. I'd love to, but I think Thomas More is an inspirational figure to someone like Colbert,
mm,
and
mm,
so we can directly see that legacy.
mm. Well, everyone in the chat, please remember that I put a link to the book, this
Thank
particular book, in the chat. I don't have the Utopia book linked in the
you.
chat, although I need to read that one next. But don't be intimidated by this. It's like 440 pages. I literally read it in like 8 hours. So,
Wow.
but I'm also a PhD student, so I'm reading faster than ever. But
Yeah.
seriously, it's an amazing read, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciated the publishers putting in slightly larger print, so I don't need my reading glasses, which was
Yeah.
fantastic.
They've done a
And it looked
beautiful job. There is an audio version
oh,
as well,
great.
which is read by Ben Miles,
Mm,
who is a fantastic actor. People might know him from The Crown or from
mhm.
Andor, but he also portrayed Thomas Cromwell on stage in the stage production of Wolf Hall.
Okay.
And he's just phenomenal, and he does the most amazing job with the audio version of the book as well. So if you're worried about carpal tunnel, holding that big old thing, you can listen to it as well.
Well, make sure you have that. I'm sure I have a few followers on here who love audiobooks,
Mm,
and some of us also don't have the time to read as much. We're driving in cars. We're
yeah,
listening now
yeah,
to
yeah,
audio work. So please take advantage of that. But as I said, I do have the physical copy linked in the chat. I also have it down below for anyone who's watching later. It is in the description below. So please grab your copy of that. Joanne, it's been such a thrill to have you on. I'm so happy that you've taken time out of your day to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. I absolutely had to do it. Not only was I sure it would be a fantastic conversation, but I had to speak with someone who's got so many Canadian flags behind him. It reminds me of home. So
Yes, an American with a bunch of Canadian flags is great.
yeah, that's all right. We
Yeah.
accept you. We accept you. Yeah.
Well, write the government so I can get my permanent residency, and we'll be good.
Yeah, I'll let them know.
Put in a good word for me. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. I greatly appreciate everyone who has been in the chat and hanging out and giving a thumbs up here on YouTube and sharing it. It means a lot to me. I'm sure it means a lot to Joanne as well, although I don't speak for her.
Yeah,
But it's
absolutely.
but please pass along the link to the book and make sure that more of Joanne's work gets out there to the public. And again, Joanne, thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.